Hi, I'm Effie and welcome to my channel, What Effie Reads. I predominantly talk about books, but I also enjoy cross-stitching, so occasionally we'll have a cross-stitch video. So today I thought I'd do something a bit different. I thought I'd talk about the books that I read for Summerween whilst stitching a sort of Halloween themed cross stitch. So I hope you enjoy, and please let me know in the comments if this is a video you'd like to see more of in the future. So Summerween is I guess like Halloween-ish readathon that I think is run by Gabby over at Gabby Reads. I have to say, it's one of those things that I've kind of known about in the periphery for a while, but haven't ever participated in before. But I do like some spooky, creepy kind of books, so I thought, why not participate this year? There are a set of prompts for the readathon, and I did try to fulfill them, but it's only a week-long readathon, and I'm not the quickest of readers. So in the end, I ended up reading 3 books, plus a bonus one that didn't technically fulfill any of the prompts, but I read it in good faith, thinking that it would fulfill some of the prompts. So the 3 books that I read were The Ripper of Whitechapel by Yvette Fielding, There's Someone Inside Your House by Stephanie Perkins, and Battle Royale Volume 9, which is the manga adaptation of the book Battle Royale by Koushun Takami, I think. Sorry, I do have notes, but apparently my brain just isn't functioning right now. So Battle Royale Volume 9 was for the prompt, read a manga, graphic novel or novella. I thought this book was a real mixed bag because I haven't read a volume of this manga for about a year, as I was so disappointed with the way that Volume 8 just kind of did my favourite character dirty. Initially, I felt like this volume was kind of rough because I was still mad about the events of Volume 8. This was combined with the fact that this format of story enables an extended backstory for characters, and the character whose backstory we were given in this volume was decidedly unpleasant. Like, think of an incel who also has an abundance of money and thus looks down on the poor, and you probably aren't picturing a character even half as vile as the one that we were exploring in this volume. Whilst I did appreciate that this character is someone that the reader is not meant to like, it didn't make it any easier to read pages and pages and pages of misogynistic thoughts. I was also frustrated by like a really small factual issue, because this character, and I guess it's kind of just like his character, like in general, but he had an injury to his right index finger, and he was claiming that it made him completely unable to play violin. And like, whilst I in no way am saying that I'm a competent violin player, I wouldn't even say that I can really play the violin, but from my limited experiences, you wouldn't need full dexterity to be able to continue to play the violin if that finger was injured. And like, especially since this character was supposedly meant to be a violin prodigy. After we got over the hump of this particular vile character, we did have a really moving and beautiful scene where one of the characters is on the brink of death and has visions of his classmates and friends who have already died during the program, which is, I've just realised I didn't say what this book is about. Like, I feel like Battle Royale's relatively well known, but basically a group of, I think they're meant to be ninth graders, are abandoned on a deserted island type situation, and they're put into a situation where they have to fight to the death, and there can only be one survivor remaining, and this is all called the program, and it's televised. So, as I was saying, this character has visions of classmates and friends who've already died during the program, and I did enjoy this scene as it felt like a nice callback to earlier events. The book then ends with a visit to the Lighthouse Girls, and the story of these girls is a really sad one, and it makes for an intriguing scene. But the reason this felt flat for me was that there's already a manga called Battle Royale Angel's Border, same universe, same author and stuff. They've just decided to expand on it, and Angel's Border, I think it has 2 stories, but the primary story of it is telling the Lighthouse Girls' story, and I felt like it delved into their backstory more. So it just felt like there was something missing from that scene in this volume of the manga. And this was a change for me, because usually I find that this manga deepens and expands the story of Battle Royale, at least when it's not trampling over the established backstory of my favourite character. I mean, overall, I feel like my thoughts and issues with this manga can be summed up by a quote that's on the back of all the volumes, and it says, "Royale hits all the manga bases: martial arts, creepy old men, panty shots, without being Sailor Moon silly." And honestly, I think that quote does a really good job of kind of summing up the issues that I have with it, because the competitors of the story, as I said earlier, are meant to all be in 9th grade, so panty shots and creepy old men is just a really gross concept for these really young characters. So unfortunately, this meant that for me, Summerween didn't start off as strongly as it could. But then I moved on to There's Someone Inside Your House, and I had such a good time with it. So this book, I believe, was for the prompt of a black cover, but it also fulfilled a book set in autumn, as well as, I guess, being a thriller. So a few things that I really appreciated about this book were the fact that it had a trans character who was a secondary character, but I still felt like they were meaningful representation. And then the main character was mixed Hawaiian and black. And again, this felt like meaningful representation. And I went into this book not realizing that there was any rep, so it was great to see. I initially did find it a bit challenging to keep track of things, as I felt like events were presented out of order, but not in the clever story building way. It'd just be like really random statements, like a character would say something about blood, but as the reader, you wouldn't know what the blood was. And then there was another moment where a character referred to someone as him, but we didn't know who the him was. And neither of these things were particularly relevant to the story. It just felt like it had been plotted a bit strangely. I'm not sure if the book simply became easier to follow as I progressed, or if it was just that I was in the wrong frame of mind when I started it, especially considering I think I went from Battle Royale onto this book. Again, I realise I've forgotten to say what this book was about. Essentially, people are being murdered in their homes, or predominantly in their homes, and we're just trying to figure out who's doing it and why they're doing it. Yeah, can't really give a good description. I'm sorry. It's just like a fun slasherish sort of story. And in fact, that's exactly how I would describe it. It felt like a classic 90s slasher, and I appreciate the sheer body count of the story, as well as just how gruesome some of the murders were. Especially because this was YA, and I have a really hard time like figuring out what age range books are meant to be anyway, but it was quite gruesome considering it is YA. I also found it refreshing that this wasn't a book where you had to wait until the end of the book to uncover the killer. It was actually revealed around the halfway mark, and that ended up having tension because whilst you knew who the killer was, like, it wasn't as if the killer had been caught, so there was a kind of creepiness of when are they going to pop up? Like, we know who they are, but when they're going to pop up, and you still didn't really know what their motivations were until very close to the end. As I said at the start of talking about this book, I did feel like the representation went beyond tokenistic, and there were a few nods to the way that marginalized identities can affect the characters' daily lives, such as a couple of mentions of microaggressions. Could the representation have been better? Sure, but it was nice to see a book written by a white author who, as far as I can tell, is cishet. Like, I try not to delve too deeply into authors' backgrounds because it feels a little invasive, but from what I can tell, the author is a white cishet woman, and she's managed to create some meaningful representation in her book, and it isn't just a case of, oh yeah, we're going to have representation, but we're not going to do much with it. And I appreciate that. I fully went into this book expecting it to be one that I would read and then unhaul, but I had like such a good time with it that I could definitely imagine myself rereading. And I think that the fact that the killer was revealed relatively early in the book adds to the rereadability of it, as the story working is not predicated on the reader not really knowing who done it. And the final book that I read specifically for this readathon and fulfilled prompts, although off the top of my head I can't remember what those prompts were, was The Ripper of Whitechapel by Yvette Fielding. This is technically book 2 in, I think it's called the Ghost Hunter Chronicles series, and the premise is fairly simple. So it's these 3 kids, I think they're in their early teens, are involved in hunting ghosts, and it seems that Jack the Ripper's ghost is haunting a local school. And not only that, but he's angry and dangerous. Unfortunately, I found this book to be an absolute slog. I think perhaps middle grade, specifically middle grade horror, is just something that I don't really enjoy. And that very much is likely to be my age. And that's fine, like, not every book is going to be for every reader. Felt as though this book spent way too long building up the background of the story rather than going into the meat of things. And this was something that I'd also experienced with another middle grade horror that I'd read recently. It just overall made the book feel very slow paced. Another thing that impacted my enjoyment was the fact that it was book 2. I felt like I was slightly missing out, as there was continuous nods to the gang's previous ghost hunting adventure. On the other hand, being very aware that it is book 2, it felt wrong that it spent so much time establishing things that I felt like should have been established in the first book. I hadn't read the first book in the series, and definitely I'm not going to bother now. I also couldn't help feeling that the continuous nods to the previous adventure would have been frustrating if you'd read a book one and were already well aware of what had happened. I also felt like the author who I believe presents Most Haunted, I'm not sure, that kind of show isn't really my cup of tea. I felt like she brought too much of her own experiences of that into the book, as she spent so much time talking about the equipment being used, and I actually felt like using like technically correct equipment took some of the fun and the joy out of the book. I either wanted the ghost hunters to be kind of old school, or I wanted more zany inventions being used. That being said, there were more zany inventions as the story progressed, but I also think that they were kind of like overcomplicated in how they worked, and I just couldn't fully get on board with them, I suppose. The other thing that I didn't like about this book, well, there was so many things I didn't like, but another thing I didn't like about this book was the fact that in this book, the representation felt tokenistic at best, and in part, it felt rubbish, poor representation, bad representation. I'm not sure. So one of the teenage ghost hunter characters is black, and like, yay, we have representation in this book. However, there never seemed to be anything about this character that provided any representation beyond him being described as black on the page. And I'm not going to dismiss the fact that having representation, even tokenistic representation, is better than no representation, but it was a bit of a shame that more wasn't done with this character. And then in terms of bad representation, there was a Syrian character that I felt was quite mismanaged. Like, he came across very poorly treated. He felt very othered, and it wasn't for a benefit of the story. He was just kind of othered. And then at one point, his accent was described as being Arabic. And now, I could be completely wrong. Like, I am a white person. You know, I do not hide this. I am as white as they come. But to my knowledge, Arabic is a language. Arabic is not an accent. And it had already been established that this character was Syrian. So could it not have been said that he had a Syrian accent? Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not really sure what a Syrian accent would sound like. I mean, accents are very, I don't know. Accents are strange. I'm not sure where my tangent was there. But yeah, the representation left a lot to be desired. And I think the final thing that I would say about this book is that the ending was like a massive cliffhanger, but in a very weird direction as well. Like, yes, this book is dealing with paranormal things, but it almost felt supernatural at the end. And then maybe there are more books being planned. Maybe the author just hasn't managed to write more books, but it felt like the story was kind of wrapped up for now, and then there was an epilogue that introduced this whole other thing, and I was like, what is going on? This just makes absolutely no sense to me. So yeah, not great. But as I say, I think very much like this isn't a book that is intended for me, and I know it's not a book that's intended for me. But yeah, just a note, unfortunately. But fair play to anyone who does read it and enjoy it. I hope you have a great time with it. But this one is definitely headed for my unhaul pile. And the final book that I read with the intention of it being for Summerween, but actually didn't fulfill any prompts. And also, I didn't read it during the week for Summerween, but because I thought it was going to fulfill some prompts, I sort of read it as a bonus after the end of the week. and that was Godkiller by Hannah Kana. And I had such a good time with it. Like, it's very much book one in a series, but the way they end was a satisfying end for now. Like, you can see there's more to the story. You kind of know where the sequels could be taking you, but the events of this book felt relatively self-contained. I read this book with the hope that it would fulfill a book set in autumn, as I asked my best friend Shannon, whose channel's Head in the Books, to basically pick all my books for Summerween, and she said that Godkiller was kind of like a autumny vibes kind of book, but it actually takes place in the spring, which fair enough. So the concept of this book is that you've got the titular god killer, so someone who goes around killing gods, and she ends up having to go on a quest with someone who is linked to a god, and also I'm not going to say a disgraced knight, but like kind of like the disgraced knight trope, like a retired knight who's on a quest for the king kind of thing. And it just created this really fun vibe where it's like a band of misfits, unlikely travel companions, and you're seeing the world built up through the stories they tell each other. I thought it was a very unique and imaginative world. Also, it is a queer normative world, which is lovely to see. Like, there's absolutely no reason why homophobia and transphobia, I don't know if there was any trans characters in Godkiller, but with it being a queer normative world, like 100% could exist, but there's no reason why homophobia and transphobia has to exist in fantasy. It is, after all, fantasy. I really enjoyed, I think the god's called Skedi. That's not his full name, but I can't remember it. I really enjoyed Skedi. He reminded me of, I think it's called the Mogger in the Sabriel series. So Skedi reminded me a lot of that character, and that was just a really fun vibe. Also, the way that the characters were flawed, like none of the characters were 100% always good or 100% always bad, and it made for a really interesting story, and I just had such a good time with it. So that was the 4 books that I read for my first time participating in Summerween, somewhat casually. I had a good time. I definitely want to participate in more of these kind of Summerween. I feel like there's maybe like 1 each season, but I could be wrong. Yeah, it was a good old time. I had some great reads, I had some very much not great reads, and I had some meh reads. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if this is the kind of content you would like to see more of in the future. But until then, love you. Bye.